All right. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us today on the webinar. In just a few minutes, we'll get started, but first I want to cover some housekeeping items for today's webinar. So everybody who's joining today, except for the presenters, has been muted. So if you do have a question, please just ask it in the question window of GoToWebinar. We'll try to get to every question either individually using the chat window or aloud during this webinar, or at the Q&A session at the end. Once the presentation begins, sometimes people have issues seeing the slides advance. So if you have that problem, just close the webinar and start it back up again, and that usually fixes things. As a reminder, we're also recording today's session, and we'll share that link out with you after the webinar. It usually takes about a week for it to be available and posted to YouTube. And I think we're about ready to get started with today's session. So thanks for registering and joining with us today. And the title of the webinar is Build Custom User Interfaces for Your Salesforce Data with the UI API. And I'm really happy to be joined here today by Kamyar and Chris. So Kamyar is the Senior Director of Product Management here at Salesforce. And Chris is the Software Engineering Architect also at Salesforce. And if you've attended Dreamforce this year, oh my gosh, it feels like it's only been a couple of days since Dreamforce has happened. But they had a talk on this topic in a breakout session in the developer track. And there's been so much enthusiasm on this topic, on the UI API and the ability to really customize your apps, that we're really happy that they were available to kind of share this same information out with everybody who either wants a reminder of what they saw at Dreamforce, or if they were unable to attend Dreamforce and wanted to check out the presentation one more time. And best of all, ask Kamyar and Chris if they have any questions about how to implement this for their own apps. And you might remember me from previous webinars. So my name is Arabella, and I'm the Director of Developer Relations for Developer Marketing here at Salesforce. So with that, I'm happy to hand this over to Kamyar, who will walk us through the UI API. So there you go.
Thanks, Arabella. And hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar on the User Interface API. We're very proud of being able to ship this API to our developer community and our customers so that they can take advantage of all the cool new functionality. So here comes the forward-looking statement slide. I'm sure you've all seen this a million times, but we need to tell you again that we're going to talk about existing and also upcoming features. So please be sure to make your purchasing decisions based on what's available publicly right now, as opposed to any upcoming features that we talk about here in this webinar. And don't forget to go social. Look us up on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, everywhere. And as Arabella mentioned, we are going to have the recording of this webinar up on YouTube for you to refer to, later on. If you have questions, as we already mentioned, please go ahead and ask them either through the question functionality in the GoToWebinar, or look us up on Twitter and the other channels that we've already covered, and we'll try to get as many of your questions answered live or after the webinar. So what are we going to talk about today? Today we're going to talk a little bit about Lightning Platform and how that has led to the user interface API that we're making available publicly. We're going to talk about the benefits and some of the use cases of the UI API. And then we're going to demo some functionality for you and show you some of the advantages of the UI API and how to use them. And the good news is that I'm also going to cover some roadmap items with you. As many of you are probably aware, our Spring 18 release just hit sandboxes this week. And so by the time you look at this webinar, chances are you can definitely look forward to the functionality that we built in our previous release that just ended, that's going to come available in the next couple of months as it gets rolled out. And then we'll set aside some time at the end to go over your questions and answer them during the Q&A. So first, let's talk about Lightning. Lightning, well, it's everything. It's platform, it's experience, it's the framework that we've built that brings you our great new UI and user experience through all these different formats, whether it's desktop, tablet, mobile. And the great thing about the framework is that we've built it such that it can be available at its many layers to our developer community. And what that means is that it's going to facilitate a very rich ecosystem where customers and developers can build all kinds of different apps, on Lightning, directly using our API and make it available to the community, and so that everyone can have better access to tools, better access to apps, and just have a better experience within Lightning. So how does that happen? Well, if you've seen our Lightning experience for desktop, you know that, and I've talked about this before in my other sessions, we have a layered stack. So what you see, for example, in our UI are the base components that are the individual components like date time and pick list, etc., that you see on the screen. And we use these base components to basically compose experience components that are more functionally rich by assembling a number of base components in order to provide a better functionality in the UI. Well, all of those components are actually built on public API. And the Lightning version of our public API is called Lightning Data Service. And Lightning Data Service is built on top of the user interface API that we're here to talk about today. And then the user interface API is obviously built on the greatest platform and database in the cloud, which is Salesforce. So you can count on having, access to, as a developer, all layers of our platform, really depending on your expertise, your needs, your use cases. And we're really proud of that here at Salesforce. So what makes the user interface API special? Well, what we like about it is that it now lets you take advantage of all the functionality and the business rules and business logic and things that we built for Lightning directly through REST API. And these API are really nice because they are runtime API that respond to metadata changes. And by metadata changes, we're talking about things like layouts. If you go and change a layout as an admin, for example, the runtime API automatically reflects the changes for you. So if you build your apps in such a way, you don't need to update them when an admin, for example, goes in and modifies layouts and makes other metadata changes. It also makes working with a lot of things easier, such as FLS, sharing, and pick lists, and all kinds of fun stuff that we're going to talk about. And it lets you use the framework of your choice. And that could be, web frameworks like React, Polymer, Angular, or mobile native frameworks such as iOS and Android. But we obviously want you to take full advantage of the great things we built into Lightning platform as well. So if you want to use and build Lightning components, then the way to do that is to use Lightning Data Service, which is the serialized version of our user interface API. So let's talk about some of these benefits that I hinted at with regards to what makes the user interface API so good to work with. Well, the payloads are smart. So we have payloads that give you data and metadata together. That saves you time for making additional API calls. It makes for smaller payloads. So there's really a lot of advantages to doing that. We also provide business logic that you don't find or you may not find in other APIs, such as providing you with clone values or default values for a record when you're trying to work with records and create new records, etc. We also support with the same API different form factors. And this is really good when you want to build responsive web pages, because you can do things like use the same API, and as people change their device or change their browser window format, you can essentially show them the mobile version versus the tablet version versus the desktop version without really working with different APIs or changing your code all that much. And as I mentioned earlier, we already handle field level security and record sharing for you. We provide localization and language support. So it's really a great way for you to save time and take advantage of all the work that we've done building the functionality that we think most developers are going to need when they build user interfaces or apps. And the cool thing about the user interface API is that they use your same org API limits. So you don't have to worry about yet a new way of keeping track of what your API usage is going to be. But before we go further, we want to demo some of these functionalities that we've talked about here. And for that, we're going to change over to Chris, who is going to show you some sample demos.
Hello. Good morning out there.
Good morning. Do you want to share your screen, Chris?
Sure. All right.
Perfect.
Great.
So here we've logged into a regular Salesforce org, and you can see we have a couple records here. Here, for example, is an account in Lex. And what if we wanted to show all the same information in the same layout, making a single XHR from a web app? Well, you can now with the UI API. So we have this sample app that's on GitHub, and we'll have the URL up in the presentation in a minute. And this sample app retrieves some MRU items, and it lets you view them. So let's take a look at that same account in this sample app. So that just made a single XHR. It retrieved all the layout information for deciding what fields go where and what the sections are. It retrieved information about layout state, which sections are collapsed. It returned information about the account and related entities involved, and it also returned the record data, all in one piece of JSON. So if you click this, this is going to show us this big hunk of JSON that we got that has everything we needed. So it has here the account default record layout. We requested both edit and view. You'll see why in a second. The view has these 5 sections with the items that you see above if you go in enough. So there we go. Here, for example, is account owner is the first item in the first row in the first section. And we're rendering it right there. Along with this layout information, we also return the record data. So here is the record and its field values. And one interesting part about the user interface API is that we by default return to you both the display value, which is formatted for the context user, and the actual numeric value, which is very helpful when you're rendering a UI. So we retrieve both the view version of layout and the edit. So if I click on edit, we can render using that same information, the edit version of the screen. So you'll see that we've broken out the address into constituent parts, for example, so it's a little bit different. And UI API also lets you make changes through patch. So we can change some values here. And hit save in the sample app, and then go back to it, and the values have changed. And that gets reflected obviously right away in the real SFX Lex page.
So Chris, I think one cool thing to highlight again is, for example, what we're able to do with compound fields. So for those of you who are familiar with Salesforce platform, we have this notion of compound fields such as addresses, where when you're creating a layout, you put in let's say a shipping address or a billing address, but really there's many individual fields, for example, that make that up. And what you saw Chris show earlier when we switched to the edit layout was that by retrieving the edit layout and switching your mode from view to edit, we actually handle the API shows you the component fields of a compound field, so that when a user is actually editing that information, it makes it a lot easier for you.
Yeah, you can take a look here. I've broken it out in the JSON in the account layout for this record type full under edit. In that section's rows, we include for the billing address item, we include broken out components for billing street, billing city, billing state, postal code, and country. So it gives you complete information about all the parts that go into that address.
Right, and a little bit, Chris is going to show you some code that covers how we build this layout so that it can respond to the metadata changes and the changes that are reflected in the API response, instead of what we find developers to do traditionally, which is to hard code their fields and their field positions.
Yeah, we can take a look just at making a quick modification to this layout. If I can remember where the button is. Here? Nope.
No, it's here.
Yeah, I'll just go through setup.
There you go.
Oh, there it is. So if I edit this layout and I move, let's say, the revenue above employees and hit save, then if I go back to my view here, what's this going to have? Then here, now we see revenues above employees. We just made another single XHR and we got the updated info right away automatically.
Right, and it's very cool because instead of you building apps with all the fields hard coded, we're able to basically construct the page in such a way so that when the fields move around, your UI just gets automatically updated. And as I said, Chris is going to show you that in the code in a little bit.
Yeah, one other thing while we're here, in the new release, we've added e-tag support. So you can see this is the record UI, which is an aggregate which returns layout and object info and records. It includes an e-tag value for the entire payload. We also include e-tag values for some of the parts that are retrievable through other endpoints. So you can retrieve the record data by itself. You can retrieve the object info and layouts by themselves. So each of those chunks has its own e-tag, which means that once your application has retrieved all this information once, it can use the e-tag as kind of a key and pass it back in your Salesforce UI API requests using the if none match header. And what happens is if the JSON that Salesforce is going to send back is exactly the same as what you got before, it will just return to you an HTTP 304 status, which indicates that nothing has changed. So that means that your application doesn't have to go through the time and effort to deserialize something that looks exactly the same as it did before. So Camiar, would you like to take a look at the code?
Yes, let's go look at the code. I think that'd be great.
So this source code, again, is all in GitHub. And this particular app was built using React along with Redux and Sagas. It runs on Node.js. But I just want to show you first just the heart of the code where we consume the JSON and turn it into the React component tree. So in this method here, this record view object is the JSON payload that came back. We're just pulling apart the record that we want, the layouts and the object info, looping through the layouts. And then for each section and each layout that we got back, we're calling this get layout section model. And that's just manipulating the JSON a bit to build the model that powers our React app. So inside that, it's just going through each row in the section. As it goes through each row, it just goes through each item. And the code here is where we treat the items. So typically, you're going to be dealing with a field. And the happy path here is, I believe down here where we just say, we got the display value that came from the display value in the JSON. We have the value that came from the value in the JSON. We throw together label information that came from the layout part and some other little bits. And then that's just the basis of what we use to render the actual component. And there's some other special cases for other types of items. If you take a look at the component side, we're using a component for a row. And when we render each cell in the row, the happy path is here. So we're just using a div for each component in the item. And we're just setting it to have a key because you need a unique key in React, and using the display value as the thing that you see on the screen. So it's pretty straightforward, normal React stuff. You could take a look over here just to see one of the HTTP requests we're making. This one is the HTTP request that powers that. So we're going to UAPI record UI with a record ID and asking for the large form factor because we're on a desktop size, and the view and edit modes, and just getting the JSON back. So it's a pretty straightforward app. I'd encourage you to check it out on GitHub.
Great. Okay, so we are going to now switch back to me and go through a couple of more things before we start the Q&A. So can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Great. So as Chris mentioned, we have made the React record viewer app that we just showed you available on GitHub. Here is the URL where you will find the apps. We also have a React Native app that you'll see. And I've also included a shortened link to our documentation. So definitely check those out. And it's really cool because we've gotten you started in terms of how to use the API and the different concepts that we've talked about. So let's take a little bit of time and talk about what are the user interface API for. At Salesforce, we have a lot of different API. They're all purpose-built. They're all good for what we built them for. For example, tooling API is great for making changes to your org and metadata, etc., from a setup perspective. And the user interface API, they're great for building user interfaces. So with that, we're talking about things like web pages. If you want to show Salesforce records and other things they're going to make available through the API, as well as being able to build native mobile apps with your own organization's custom look and feel, or maybe even business logic. This should make a lot of things easier to do that. And then Salesforce platform is really known and highly regarded for its declarative functionality. A lot of admins and users love Salesforce for that. We love Salesforce for that because it makes it really easy to go set up your org and make it available to your users. And we wanted to build an API that reflects those changes just as easily. And you saw that when Chris was showing you, something simple like changing a layout and seeing it reflected right away in the app. But it also works with other changes as well, metadata changes as well. For example, if you go and change the FLS, field level security for a user, then that'll get reflected as well in the API without you having to specifically change your app to account for it. So what are they not for? Well, like we talked about, we have API that are purpose-built. So, they're great for building user interfaces. But what if you're using, Salesforce API to do, data uploads or system integration or data extraction? For that, you have probably been using the SObjects API, and we recommend that you continue to use that. They're great for that. There's many reasons why the SObject API are better for system integration versus the user interface API. But as an example, the user interface API is really tied to the user context and metadata. So for example, when you request a record, you also specify a layout format, like a full layout for that user, and we only return to you the fields that are on that layout for that user. Well, that might not be really ideal for system integration, because when you're integrating two systems, you probably care about all the fields on a particular object. So, consider those things carefully and, plan for them accordingly. The other thing that they're not for is for building Lightning components. Now, the reason is we already take things a step further with Lightning Data Service. Hopefully, many of you are familiar with Force Record Data. And Lightning Record Service is essentially the serialized version of the User Interface API for building Lightning components. And what that means is that when you're working with the User Interface API, you don't really have to worry about making REST calls and caching your results. Lightning Data Service actually does all of that stuff for you, such as caching and managing when to refresh the cache and update data and metadata. So it's just an easier way to build Lightning components, and we definitely recommend you doing that. And then one other thing that we need to talk about is our support for User Interface API. As you know, at Salesforce, we have support for our API for 3 years, and we would like to enforce that for the User Interface API. So that means that when you build apps, when you build web pages that use UI API, we recommend that you keep them up to date and you update your versions to keep them in sync with changing business logic and the new functionality. So keep that in mind as well. So, User Interface API were GA in the winter release. The upcoming spring release, spring 18, is really our second GA release. So we've added a lot of new functionality that we'll talk about. But it's important to highlight the things that we are already delivering. There's a lot of cool things, a lot of important and necessary things for building custom user interfaces. And the most important thing, obviously, at Salesforce is records. And so we have built endpoints that give you record data, record layouts, object metadata. As you saw, we support things like view and edit mode, as well as clone and defaults. We've done a lot of work with pick lists and dependent pick lists because they're probably one of the most widely used metadata across customers and ISVs in Salesforce, but they're really, really difficult to work with when you're using API. And so we like to think that we've made it very easy to use pick lists and dependent pick lists in our API, and we'd like to hear you confirm them. So check it out. Let us know if we've kept that promise. We've also made things like junction lists through child relationships, child records to an existing records a lot easier to work with. So you don't have to construct your own queries that join two records. And we've also added support for files. So now when you are building UI and you have, you're working for a record, you can actually upload files and relate it to those records, just like you see in our apps. One of the other things that we did and we have shipped for the User Interface API is list of actions. So if you have used Salesforce One and Lightning Experience, you know that we have the list of actions that have their own metadata specific to Salesforce One and Lightning that show up in the action bar in our mobile app, as well as the action ribbons in our desktop experience. And prior to having the user interface API for them, you would have needed to use SOQL to actually find out what actions are available for a particular record. With the endpoint that we're talking about here, we've made it easier for you to fetch a list of actions that are valid for a record for that user, just like the ones you see in our app and our UI. So hopefully that's also very beneficial when it comes to building on top of the UI API. The other interesting piece, then this is one of actually my favorite features, no pun intended, is the favorites functionality. So in Lightning Desktop, we have the favorites functionality. It's the star in the header where you can mark things such as records and list views and many different things as a favorite so that you can quickly navigate back to it. That now has a UI API so that you can incorporate it into your custom user interface. And we've also solved another very difficult API challenge when it comes to UI API, which is to support dependent lookups. Check out our dependent lookup endpoint, which allows you to relate records through a field. It's really cool. It lets you do full search, type ahead. It returns the results based on the lookup functionality that you've set up in your org. So we hope that you will find the value in this one as well as you're working through your different use cases. Now the fun stuff. So let's talk about what is coming out in Spring 18. As I said, I believe sandboxes already reflect Spring 18, and if not, they will very shortly. And then, we're only a couple of months away from Spring 18 being in production. And we've added some really nice things to the API. You may have heard me say earlier that records are the most important thing, so we did them first. Well, lists are the second most important thing. So now we're supporting list and list view through the UI API. And for lists, you're going to be able to use UI API to retrieve list of records, as well as list view metadata, which should come in very handy as you build your custom user interfaces. We've also created a dependent pick list graph. This is actually, again, a really, really nice feature that should make working with pick lists very easily. If you have use cases where you have multiple levels of dependent pick lists, it's particularly difficult to build the UI on top of it. And we'd like to think that we've made that really easy. And in a second, I'm going to switch back and have Chris show you a demo of how we've done that, just kind of as a teaser as we switch over to our Q&A part of the webinar. And the other nice thing that we've shown is, that we've added is we have an endpoint that gives you a list of all the supported objects, standard and custom, through available through the UI API. And the nice thing about this endpoint is that it gives you the object API name as well as the labels. So in case of custom objects that you may have in your apps, if you're an ISV, or custom objects that you've added to your org, this endpoint will list out all the custom objects that you have, and they'll actually provide the labels as well, so you can use them again to easily build UIs. And I believe Chris also covered e-tags. So for those of you who may not be familiar with e-tags, they are invalidation headers. And the way we intend to support e-tags is very close to the standard, which is we provide an e-tag hash to you for each payload. And then what you can do is when you make subsequent API calls, if you include that e-tag in your request, we will check the e-tag, and if your data or metadata has changed, we provide you with the new data or metadata. if your data or metadata has not changed, and we can tell by the E tag, then we return to you a 304 message, which tells you that you don't need to refresh your screen or change your cache in case you decide to cache your metadata. And so we think it's particularly useful for building mobile apps. That's how our internal teams intend to use them, because it really does cut down on the amount of network traffic usage, as well as addresses issues around, when there are network latencies, for mobile use cases. And then some future stuff to talk about. I mentioned the list view records and metadata that are going to be made available as part of Spring 18. Our list team is also fast at work to provide endpoints for MRU, most recently used records, as well as a list of all list views. So for each user, you'll be able to retrieve all their list views so that you can then show the individual list view. We're also working on a global nav menu endpoint. So these are the navigation items in Lightning desktop experience that you see across the top that show you the tabs, for example, for different objects that a user has access to. And we're also working on some cool things like related list endpoint, as well as field sets, which is something that's used a lot by our ISVs, and we'd like to support those as well. So with that, I'd like to switch back to Chris so that he can show you the example that we built for dependent pick lists. Chris?
Hello again.
So
I'm going to take over
your
control
screen
here.
again. Cool.
Yep.
Perfect.
Welcome back. So I'm in a different org this time. And in this org, we've set up, here's an account, and we have some dependent fields here. So we've set it up so that the country, if you're in the US, you can choose Spanish or English, and you can pick a corresponding city to the state that you're in. But if you switch to Canada, you can pick English or French, and you have Canadian cities to choose from. So if we take a look in the record viewer app again, this is the new version of the code that will be released on GitHub when the spring release comes out. One thing is now this object selector for letting you create a new record is based on the new object info catalog endpoint in UIAPI. That endpoint lists all the standard objects that are supported for UIAPI in your org along with your custom objects, and it provides you the API name along with the label, so you can easily show something friendly to to end users. So we take a look at that same record in the record viewer. One new thing that we have is under the object info. So you can get the same thing out of the singular object info endpoint. But here it's within the record UI aggregate. You get a new property called dependent fields. And this property gives you a tree of the dependent field, a forest of trees for the dependent fields in your entity. So it's very clear here that country dictates language in state province, and state province dictates city. Now, if you go and edit this particular record, in the background, this retrieved from the new pick list, pick list values endpoint. If I can just get my scroller to let me scroll, just a sec. Tricky things in Mac. Here, so we can see the JSON here. And so we called this new endpoint, which gives you the pick list field values for this record type. And it's telling me that for city, I have these possible values. So Albany is valid for certain case, Calgary, all these different dependent pick list values and where they're legal. Using that information and the information from that dependency graph tree, we can build a integrated dependent pick list editor. So here, if I hit this, we've set up this editor so that when you change things, everything kind of cascades together. And that's all just based on the result of those 2 API calls. You can set your stuff and save it.
How cool is that?
So it's really simplified the process of using dependent pick lists, which we're aware can be pretty tricky at times.
Great. Thank you, Chris.
No problem.
And let's talk about next steps. Well, we want you to go to Trailhead and check out our API basics. That'll get you started on things like building a connected app and using OAuth for accessing API. You should also check out our mobile SDK. There's some really nice information there. As well as, if you're not, definitely get familiar with Salesforce DX and our continuous integration, because it just makes development on top of Salesforce that much easier, and we're all huge fans of it. And in time with our Spring 18 go live, we should have our Trailhead modules up as well. So when you're on Trailhead, periodically check for UI API trails and modules, and we should get those up in the next month or two as well. And those will help you walk through, how to use the API and all the benefits. Okay.
Great. Well, I think we find ourselves at the Q&A section, the questions and answer part of our webinar. So I know for a lot of everybody joining here, this is the favorite part of the webinar, because people get to ask you directly if they have any questions about what you presented. So thanks everybody for sharing your questions. We have quite a few questions here, so I'll just dive into it. So the first question that we've got for you is, would we need to buy more API calls?
So I'm glad you asked. As I mentioned earlier, we use the same org API limits that you have for using any of the API. You don't need to buy anything specific for the UI API, but obviously, as your usage of the API goes up, whether it's UI API or other API, you can buy the additional API packs or licenses as appropriate. So, nothing tricky there. It all just depends on usage.
Okay, great.
And actually, one other thing I should add, one of the things that I like about the UI API and how they help with the API limits is that with the UI API, we combine many API calls underneath into one payload. So when we talk about giving you data and metadata together, or providing you with display values and localization information, for us, those are many API calls if you're using our traditional Salesforce API. But in the UI API, you just make the one call, and that counts as basically 1 point towards your limit. So if anything, if you start using the UI API, you might find that you're using less in terms of API calls.
Huh, that's really good to know.
Yep.
Thanks for throwing that in there. So the next question that we have on our list is, will the code for the record viewer be made available?
Yeah, it's already available on GitHub. What was the URL again, Cameron? Was on one of the
I'm
slides.
going to quickly flash back.
It's under the force.com repo, and it's named Record Viewer. There's also a version for Objective-C for React Native called Record Viewer Native. So between those two, hopefully there's a fair amount of sample code.
Yeah,
right.
There's a lot in there.
Just go to sfdc.co/UI API sample apps.
And we'll also tweet the links out for this after the webinar, just so it's really easy for everybody. You don't have to wait a week for this to be made available. We'll make sure of that.
Right. And one other thing I'll add is we have a group in Success Community called User Interface API.
Trailblazer community.
Trailblazer community. So definitely, you can find us there. The entire team is there. We have MVPs asking questions you might find useful. Feel free to go there, ask questions, give us suggestions. We look forward to hearing from you there as well.
Great. So the next question that we have is a custom address field on the roadmap so we can create a compound field of type address as a custom field?
That is a very popular request. It's not particular to the user interface API. It's actually more for our core teams. And although I can tell you it is something that we're considering, I do not know the exact release date for when we can have basically a custom address field that you could add to objects, separate from the address fields that you can add to like accounts.
Okay, so good that you mentioned that one and that you're aware of that. So the next question we have here is, does the API also support buttons?
So by buttons, I assume you're referring to actions. And so I mentioned an endpoint where we return a list of actions with metadata. So if you check out our actions endpoints, there's many different endpoints because you can have actions on many different, in many different places, such as on a list, on a record, and basically each of those lists is tailored to the context user. And if your context user is able to see a custom button in their particular UI, then it shall be reflected in the user interface API response, and it will include the metadata such as the URL that you've associated and set up to that custom button.
Okay, great. Thanks. So the next question here, this comes up a lot, especially as Salesforce is lightning everything. But the question we have here is, does UI API also work with Salesforce classic views, like page, layouts, etc.?
I can take that one, I think. So the UI API is built to reflect what you see in the Lightning experience. So in terms of, it's going to be more of a one-to-one match against Lightning experience. However, Lightning is using the same layouts that power the traditional UI, and it's all the same metadata. So the layouts that you use in Aloha are the same layouts that you use in Lex, is the same layouts that come out of UI API.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks, Chris. So the next question we have here is, if you have more than one page layout, how does it decide which one to use?
Sure. So for this one, we have multiple different endpoints. In the case of the record UI endpoint, which I was focusing on, that endpoint, you pass in a record ID. We use that record ID to get the record type. And you also tell us if you want to see the full or the compact are options as query parameters. So using that information, we're able to pivot to get the correct layout. It'd be the same layout that context user would see for that record in the UI. If you hit the layout endpoint, you can explicitly provide us record type and again get the right layout for that record type.
Great, thanks for that. We've actually had a few questions along that same line in the Q&A field. So I think with that answer, you've actually answered a few different people who are asking the same thing.
Great.
Great. So the next question we have here is, does file upload support single operation for multiple file upload?
And the answer is yes. You can provide us a multi-part binary parts as part of your request. And if you name those after the fields, then you can set multiple binary field values at the same time.
Okay, great. Thank you. So another question we have here, it's slightly different. So can I make the API as public without authentication? The scenario is, there are some business users who don't need Salesforce license, but I'm planning to build an API where it gives them info about a record with BID hard-coded.
So the user interface API doesn't have its own special authentication or authorization mechanism. We're using typically OAuth, just like every other API at Salesforce. So it's the same answer you'd get there, which is that typically it should be a single. You shouldn't use one user as a proxy for a bunch of other people. It's not really a supported scenario. Camille?
Yeah, I agree. It's definitely not supported, and we discourage it because the API is heavily reliant on user context to provide data and metadata. And it's important to stay with that model because it impacts data security and many things that an org admin relies upon. So we would never want anyone to circumvent that. So you definitely have to have licenses and actual users to access the API.
All right, thanks for the clarification. So I think that leads us into the next question here in our Q&A, which is, could you give us a couple of high-level use cases for the UI API?
Sure. I think the easy one is, and Chris, chime in whenever you want. I think the easy one is mobile apps. A lot of our customers like to build, very custom native mobile apps that do specific things and work with Salesforce data. And so it's a really good use case for that because it allows you to do things like caching and be efficient in the way you make the API calls and the amount of information you get back. The other use case is we have lots of customers who build on Heroku. This makes it easier to work with Salesforce data when you build on Heroku. So those are a couple of use cases that pop up.
Yeah, it's also just useful for anywhere you want to have a UI that's using your own look and feel, but you still want to incorporate Salesforce information the way that it's laid out in Salesforce in a simple way. So for example, if you are a customer that's using our Quip product, Quip has integrated a feature called, I believe it's called Live Record Views, and that is based on using UI API. We worked with the Quip developers, basically just threw them our documentation and they threw it together pretty fast.
Yeah. And I know a lot of our large customers like to set up portals for their users where they're incorporating data and information from multiple systems, to support complex business processes for those users. And the user interface API support cores. For those of you who are familiar with cross-origin resource sharing. We support that across our API now at Salesforce, and this is one way where you can, build a custom portal that accesses multiple systems and takes information from different sources and makes it available. And if those portals rely on, things that need to have metadata, this is a great way to do that.
Okay, great. Chris, did you have anything else you wanted to add in?
No, that's good.
Okay, great. So we have a specific use case that I'll throw at you guys, and I'd like to get your thoughts on it. So the question here is, so if I currently have a native app that uses the iOS SF SDK for querying, syncing, and storing records for offline usage, as well as some custom-built code to store edits and object creation done in offline and upload them when connectivity becomes available, can I use the UI API to do pretty much the same thing? That was a long question, so.
Yeah, that's exactly my first, use case that I talked about at the previous previous question, which is what you just asked. And we like to think that with the UI API, you can simplify the things that you're doing, and especially around caching, using e-tags would be beneficial. So that you can invalidate your data or metadata accordingly before you sync when you're, let's say, offline. And we're doing a lot more in terms of our roadmap when it comes to supporting those types of use cases. So, definitely keep up to speed with us. And like I said, come to our, community and give us your questions there as well and your feedback.
Okay, great. Thanks. Sorry, Chris, were you going to say something?
Nope.
Okay. Another question we have here is, can GitHub code include a sample code for how to invoke the UI API for a standard object?
The sample app does include like whatever objects are in your org, but it seems like there's a lot of interest in kind of having simpler, more straightforward samples. So I'm going to talk with our documentation folks to try and get some more sample code out somehow in the next couple months.
Great, and I think this actually has a lot in common with what you guys mentioned before. We're working towards getting more Trailhead module content out regarding the UI API. So keep your eyes peeled for that, and that should be a lot more accessible once that module is released.
Yep.
Okay, let's see. We have a few more minutes, so let's just look through here to see if there's other questions we have for you. We have a lot of fresh ones that have been added just in the past couple of days. So, so the one question we have here is it possible using community public guest users to access UI APIs for the public users without a license? I think you mentioned something along these lines.
Yes,
right?
Go ahead,
that's not possible.
Yeah.
Okay. Sure. I think another question we have here is there any overlap between the UI API and the mobile SDK?
So I wouldn't necessarily call it overlap. Our mobile SDK currently supports the existing API that you would use to build mobile apps. We're actually working with the team to add support for the UI API within the mobile SDK so that you can actually use it and get up and running a lot faster. So there's, in terms of overlap, there will be once they start supporting it, and then it'll be one of the other one of the many APIs that are supported through the mobile SDK. The mobile SDK doesn't replace it per se.
I'm seeing a question about pagination for the list view API, and
yeah, that's a good one.
To answer that one, I believe that there is pagination support, so you can get one page of records at a time for whatever size page you want.
Okay, great. Thank you for that, Chris. I think we have time for one final question before we close our webinar for the day. And this last one is, how can we use SFDC page layouts metadata with the UI API to build Heroku APIs for mobile apps?
So that's a great question, and it would be nice if maybe you can follow up with us with further questions. But basically, the UI API give you already what you need to build on Heroku. So I don't know what more APIs you would build in Heroku. But basically, you can build Heroku pages that reflect layouts that have been configured, in Salesforce. And essentially, our record viewer app runs on Heroku, right, Chris?
Yeah, it's a Node.js app that we happen to deploy to Heroku.
Yeah. So that's already running on Heroku.
Boom.
You don't need to do anything else. That's one of the use cases as well.
Great. So thank you so much for joining us both today, Chris and Kanyar. So as a reminder, you can ask any questions on the Trailblazer community, formerly known as the Success Community, and feel free to also ask these guys questions directly on Twitter. So I know, Kanyar, you have your username. Can you remind me what that is?
It's my Twitter handle is Cam, K-A-M 7-A-R.
Okay, great. And thanks again for joining us today. And we hope you have a really great rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening. Thanks again.
Yes, thank you, everybody.
Thanks, folks.